Hi, my name is Sophia Ellis. The article that I chose is titled The Role of Language and Literacy Skills in Science Learning from Kindergarten to Fifth Grade, Mitigating Gender, Racial/Ethnic, and Socioeconomic Disparities. In terms of the research questions, there were two. The first one is, how did patterns and variations in children's attainment of the science learning threshold evolve over time? The second research question is, what characteristics of children were associated with exceeding the science learning threshold? In terms of the first research question, how did patterns and variations in children's attainment of the science learning threshold evolve over time? I determined that it was indeed internally valid because it utilizes the words evolve over time. This shows how children can develop. In addition, I felt it was internally valid because it says patterns and variations, which shows how children learn at different rates, which avoids a one-size-fits-all approach. Both allow us to make inferences about children. In terms of reliability, I felt that it was reliable because it models developmental trajectories which can be replicable. In terms of the second research question, which states what characteristics of children were associated with exceeding the science learning threshold, I felt that this was internally valid because it demonstrates how every participant is different. In terms of reliability, I felt that it was reliable because it yields data-driven insights. In terms of the participants, researchers got their data from Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey in terms of a kindergarten class between 2010 and 2011. The study consisted of 18,174 children across 1,328 schools. This is a longitudinal study that follows these students from kindergarten to fifth grade. The participants consisted of 51% males and 49% females. In terms of ethnicity and race, 24% of students were Hispanic, 3.8% of students were two or more races. This little red section here represents 1% of students who were American Indian/Alaska Native, as well as American/Pacific Islander. About 7.7% of students were Asian, 12.5% of students were Black, and 51% of students were Caucasian. In terms of language, about 80.8% of students spoke English, 18.2% spoke a different language, and 1% spoke multiple languages. Finally, in terms of socioeconomic status, about 62.1% of students had an income that was above the federal poverty level. About 24.1% of students had an income below the federal poverty level, and about 13.8% of students had an income between 100% and 199% of the federal poverty level. So the following measures consisted of a reading assessment and a science assessment. The reading assessment just got a take on what students' reading levels were at and how their language was. I felt that these measures were internally valid because of the following quote. It says, questions, response options, and any visible text, example graph labels, were read aloud, minimizing the impact of reading skills on science assessment scores. In other words, by reading these science questions aloud, it made it valid because we knew that students' literacy and language could not be taken into account on the science assessment. Did I find this reliable? No. I said that this was low reliability because the article did not go into specifics on what the reading and science assessment consisted of, so I do not think it could be replicable. In terms of the first research question, which again says, how did patterns and variations in children's attainment of the science learning threshold evolve over time? It was measured using the Kaplan-Meier survival analysis method. This method captured the evolving relationship between child developmental characteristics and the attainment of the science learning threshold. So I said that it is indeed internally valid because it applies to children and we can make inferences about them and their developmental characteristics. In terms of reliability, I do believe it is replicable because it includes a diverse representation of children. In terms of the second research question, again, what characteristics of children were associated with exceeding the science learning threshold? This was measured using the multi-level Cox regression analysis. Basically, child characteristics were categorized as time invariant, example gender, or time varying, example literacy skills, and tests to ascertain their association with achieving the science learning threshold. So it measured the threshold. I said this was internally valid because it demonstrates how every participant is different. In terms of reliability, I said no because I don't think we could replicate this because it did not go into specifics as to what that science threshold is. In terms of major findings for different ethnicities and races, here is a graph that shows the difference between Black students and non-Black students as it applies to reaching the science threshold. This 1.0 here means that it is 100%, that is 100% reach the threshold, and the percentages I'm about to list apply to the amount of students who have yet to reach that threshold. Red here represents Black students, and blue here represents non-Black students. So in second grade, we see about 97% of Black students have not reached the threshold, and about 95%. We can see that across grade 3, grade 4, and then grade 5, we can see that there is a significant difference here in the amount of students who are reaching that threshold, because by grade 5, about 58% of Black students have yet to reach that threshold, and only 39% of non-Black students have yet to reach that threshold. Similar graph here for Hispanic versus non-Hispanic students. Hispanic students are represented in red, non-Hispanic students are represented in blue. Here in grade 2, we see that about 98% of Hispanic students have yet to reach that threshold, and 93% of non-Hispanic students have not reached the science threshold. We move across grade 3, grade 4, and grade 5. You can see some significant differences here as it applies to those students reaching the threshold. And by grade 5, we have about 56% of Hispanic students below the threshold, but only 32% of non-Hispanic students beneath the threshold. The findings are as follows. The likelihood of surpassing the science learning threshold significantly increased when children were older, male, non-Black, non-Hispanic, from high-income families, and who had advanced language and literacy skills. So, did the findings address the research questions? I believe so, because it showed evolution of science attainment over time and showed characteristics of students. So in terms of implications for practice, I have a couple things. One, it claims that girls, as a marginalized group in science education, and they attribute this to women's enduring underrepresentation in science careers. So they say that girls performed worse due to their underrepresentation in STEM. They said something similar in terms of the racial disparities due to departures from STEM majors, stereotypes, and the absence of support. So what is my solution? We should demonstrate representation in the classroom so students feel more confident in their abilities. Socioeconomic status allows for quantity and quality of educational materials. Example, science books, kits, online learning tools, laboratory equipment, and the range of experiences available to them. Example, extracurricular activities, field trips to science museums, participation in science camps. So how can we make it more equal? I'm not actually quite sure, but this is something we should think about. Finally, educators must pay attention to academic language as an implication for practice. In terms of area for future research, recent studies have yet to supply compelling evidence of effective strategies for enhancing science education through cross-domain learning. In addition, further research is required to understand the nuanced influence of language and literacy across diverse science branches and learning environments. Here's my references. Thank you.